Actually, it is my honor to introduce George Frederickson. I understand, actually, this is your last lecture for this series, so it's an extra honor for me to introduce George. But actually, since George actually needs no introduction, I think I'm just going to take this opportunity to make a few personal comments. I came to KU in 1981. I know there are people in this room who weren't born then, but I came to KU in 1981, and George joined us in 1987. So for most of my career, 25 years of it, I've had the rare privilege of having George as a colleague. I know scholars across the globe who consider George a mentor, a friend, and a co-conspirator. But only few of us have had the opportunity to share day-to-day faculty work with George. He has always been generous with his time and insight. I doubt that I would have been able to do what work I have done, which is questionable, without George's guidance and encouragement. He's a serious scholar who taught us that scholarship is great fun. He cares deeply about students and public service, and these beliefs have shaped and will shape our school well into the future. So thank you, George, for the extraordinary opportunity of sharing a career with you. Today, George will speak on public management and authentic innovation.
Well, thank you. That's very nice. Can I be heard all right? My voice is the voice of a 77-year-old man, is what it is. So I need to kind of work at it. Before I start, I would like to thank Mary Lou, our director, my colleagues and friends, and especially one person who has helped me for these 4 lectures as my assistant. She has endured the rehearsals, and she manages the PowerPoint, and she's just been terrific. I'd appreciate a little applause for Elisa Moldavanova. And you might wish her a bit of luck. She defends her dissertation on Thursday. I've chosen to talk today about public management and what I label authentic innovation. At the risk of overreaching, I wish to address 4 aspects of public administration: management, innovation, ranking, and isomorphism. I'm not going to deal in detail with each of these subjects as a subject by itself. What I wish to deal with is how each of these 4 things connect to each other. I'm interested in how they overlap, how they're glued together, what the grout is that connects them, and how those connections seem to work. By management, I wish to include organization. You could have put management and organization, but I hope the word management will stand in for management and organization. By innovation, I would include creativity and all the sort of variations that we use when we use the word innovation. That word will also stand in for a bundle of ideas that I'll be talking about. Ranking is a word like that too. I wish to include in that category all forms of ordinal measurement: greater, lesser, more, less. We like the word metrics these days. I wish to include metrics and rankings. Testing systems, no child left behind. So this is a broad use of the word ranking. And isomorphism is, well, I'll fuss with that when I come to it. I wish to start with innovation and management, and to start with 3 big studies of management and innovation in industry and business. One is Breakthroughs by Nyack and Ketteringham, excuse me. The other is Collins and Porras, Built to Last, The Successful Habits of Visionary Companies. The word habits is popular in this literature for some reason. And the final one is, in the business literature, is Clay Christensen's The Innovator's Dilemma. I'd like to sort of sum up what seems to me to be their essential findings. First, that there are many forms of innovation. The one with which we are most familiar is IT. We're all old enough to have seen those changes, and they happen routinely and regularly, and we've come to expect it. What's going to be next? What are we going to be carrying in our pocket, having in our car, wearing in our ear, so on. But there are other kinds of innovation that are equally important. Organizational. Those of you who work at the University of Kansas are familiar with, we're now establishing these centers. What are these centers? Shared service centers. Well, but it certainly is presented as an innovation. That we're rearranging the university, and this is this not presented to us as if it is innovative?
Yes.
It is.
I may have touched a sensitive nerve. Policy innovation. We think of, I think of no-fault insurance. Started in one state, went soon to another, and then to 3 more, and then to 8 more as a policy innovation. We've got a variety of versions of that around. The most recent is the subject of the research of Professor Maynard Moody and Professor Epp. This would be applications of what is broadly known as broken windows theory, or preventative action theory, or whatever. What would be the best broad phrase for that?
Broken windows is probably the best.
Yeah. And then managerial innovations. Community policing would be an example. One that is really interesting is these new protocol management ideas, drawn interestingly enough from the fast food industry, but now being used in hospitals and various other places. I won't bore you with the details of protocol theory, but it is the hot new management theory. Well, there are many forms of innovation. What the people who've researched this on the business side have found is that genuine innovation is often more artistic than it is scientific, which is interesting to me. And that innovation is often ideas that are responding to no obvious need as often as ideas responding to an obvious need. And that while being a little counterintuitive, makes a kind of sense. I still don't quite understand texting. And I expect the people who innovated to establish texting, they had to be thinking to themselves, why don't these people just talk on the telephone? But they knew and understood something about young people and about how they wish to communicate, and that I didn't understand. And anyway, a lot of IT innovation is the creation of technologies for which there isn't an apparent need. But eventually we would come to think it to be useful. Innovation is more often individual than in the group. Innovation is seldom achieved by reorganization or changing structure. I thought of the recent announcement of the new director, the new CEO of Yahoo, who announced that that working at home, what do they call it? Telecommuting, that they're going to stop telecommuting and everybody was going to have to go to the office to increase creativity. So that gives you an idea of the reasoning and logic that is often associated with innovation. They find that innovation often emerges from untidy, disorganized, or experimental organizational settings. We have a whole model for that, the R&D model, as a way to organize. A flatter hierarchy and soft management, staggered and scattered working hours, and you've all seen the pictures of working settings in Silicon Valley and people sitting around on bean bags and stuff like that. The sort of concluding point that I want to mention that I found in this literature that is really interesting, and that is the general assumption going in to their study of it, that innovation is something that can be managed, that everything can be managed. We're managers, we're organizers. We work in settings where we organize and manage things, and how can innovation be anything that isn't subject to our capacity to manage it? I'd like to come back to that. Innovation, we learn from this literature that there are several things that are less likely when innovation is less likely when targets are set. That comes directly from Deming, who argued in his formulation of total quality management that if you're managing properly and effectively, and you have a sense of what the customers want, productivity will take care of itself. And to lay targets out there causes people to cheat, and so on. But virtually every version of managed innovation I know of includes targets. But the literature tells you flat out, don't use targets. Now I want to come back to that. I'm going to make a few, now that I'm within 2 months of no longer having to work for the University of Kansas, I'll make a couple of remarks about the university. That's for the pleasure of those who are visiting here from other universities. You can be amused. Innovation is less likely when risk-taking is discouraged. When there are layers of smart managers, I used to run a university years ago, and one of the things that I had to learn by experience that wasn't in the literature at the time was that really smart people have very good critical capacities, and they can find fault with everything. And they particularly have a capacity to stop things before they're able to happen. And if you have layers of smart people, it's deadly for people who are attempting to be creative. If an organization is in too much of a hurry, when creative people are not protected from lawyers and accountants, I probably could add in other professions. When there's not a core ideology or an agreed upon sense of purpose. Well, that's my attempt to connect the general idea of management to the general idea of innovation, and to see how they overlap and how they interact with each other. Now, a brief review of the one best study of innovation in the public sector. It's done by Paul Light. The subject is what he called sustained innovation. We might say sustainability and innovation. He studied, he took all of the public organizations and nonprofit organizations in the state of Minnesota and studied them for a while to find which ones had lasted the longest and seemed to be doing the best work. And reduced it down to 26. He had a team of researchers. And then did a book trying to explain how these organizations had survived how they had done well and why it was different from the organizations that weren't doing as well. And this is what he found, that in such institutions that they're often ill-organized, confused about reporting lines, untidy and efficient, but open and democratic, and that reorganization seldom helps, restructuring seldom helps. There tended to be high trust between staff, between one another, and between staff and clients. That there was faith in the organizational mission, and and he insisted on this, that money had to be carefully managed. That you can't presume to be sustainable if you're not taking care of the money properly. And that it helps if there are outcome metrics that are reliable, so you can sort of tell how you're doing. And that this sort of surprised me because it sounds a little bit like a Sunday school lesson, but that sustainable public and non-profit organizations tend to practice a kind of rigorous optimism, starting at the top, but generally shared among the employees, which I didn't pick up a phrase like that or that word in any of the business literature. Now let me turn to the subject of the diffusion of innovation. My former students would be deeply disappointed in me if I did not discuss the S-curve. Empirically reliable knowledge of institutional innovation and creativity is complemented by a robust understanding of the diffusion of innovation. Public management is not so much the management of innovation as it is the management of the diffusion of innovation. Innovation diffusion exhibits a common pattern, the S-curve. At first, the adoption of innovation is slow, with experimentation, trial and error, and the challenge of being the guinea pig. First successful innovators have a big advantage. Once a few others adopt an innovation successfully, there tends to be a steep climb in adoption, followed by a leveling off. All three of the empirical studies of business innovation and the light study of government and nonprofit organizations, as well as many studies of the diffusion of organizational innovation, form a pattern. The pattern of organizational innovation and its diffusion shows that innovations can occur in organized and managed settings, but that there is a disconnection between the logic of managed innovation and, as Light puts it, sustained innovation. Both approaches have an emphasis on the organization's mission, on encouraging some risk-taking and forgiving failed risk, on outcomes and performance, on a call for ideas or a marketplace of ideas, and on customers or clients. The disconnection has to do with an emphasis in managed innovation on traditional strategic planning, on the formalized importing of the innovation of others, on goal clarification, on order, on the visions of leaders, and on the advice of consultants found in the logic of managed innovation. Now, I'm going to be talking again a little bit later about strategic planning. But what I've just described there is the logic of strategic planning as it connects to innovation and the probabilities of innovation. And I described it here as a disconnection, and I believe it to be a disconnection. I'm going to attempt to defend that argument. Put in extremely simple terms, that strategic planning may not be the friend of innovation. The evidence for sustained innovation describes relatively untidy, even chaotic work environments. Such creative places avoid an overemphasis on planning, and emphasizes instead doing and experimenting. While there is an emphasis on performance, it falls far short of a preoccupation with measuring it. In such creative places practice high decentralization, employee ownership of the processes of work and leadership, which is at once able to decide and highly democratic and communicative. Put simply, one approach assumes that innovation can be managed, and the other approach assumes that the organization must be managed, and if rightly managed, it will innovate. That may be a subtle difference, or it may be semantic or overly semantic, but it's one of the points I wish to make. Now, shifting from innovation and management and the diffusion of innovation, I'd like now to turn to a comparison, and it's on what page? It's on page 12 in your version. I have a much different version with big font so I can read it. So I'm out of sync with your pages. This is an heuristic, a typical academic thing we do to attempt to compare things. And you'll see in this table very brief phrases attempting to summarize whole ideas and bodies of ideas. And such an heuristic is often stylized. Whoever creates it can be accused of pushing ideas, exaggerating them, overly simplifying them. All of those things are true. Nevertheless, in the middle column is my attempt to summarize and synthesize what seems to me to be the approach to innovation that I found in the business literature. And the sustained innovation model in the right-hand column is a similar presentation of what seems to me to be the argument in sustained innovation. That they have somewhat different perspectives on organization, as you'll see there. Loosely coupled. I've heard that described as something, a pending divorce. That's not what I mean. You're all familiar with tightly coupled systems, loosely coupled systems. Reorganization. I love the way that the neo-institutionalists describe reorganization, because I believe it to be empirically right most of the time. And that is that real reorganization is something that happens sort of organically, and at some stage along the way, people capture it and describe it as a reorganization. And that it formalizes developments that are taking place, as against that's the kind of reorganization that works and is lasting, becomes a part of the culture, the context, and that top-down driven, managed reorganization, restructuring doesn't. You're welcome to be amused by my characterization of leadership. My poor students have suffered through my lectures on gardening. And the point is the business literature is too heavy for my taste on the leader as an heroic architect, the change agent, the visionary. You show me someone who is appointed the new CEO of a company who says, I have come here to change your culture, and I will show you a pompous ass. How often have you heard that? cultures, if there's anything about a culture, it resists change. And if there's anything about a culture, it's going to resist somebody who says they're going to come there to change the culture. So how do cultures change? They do change and can change. And I think it comes more nearly through the logic of someone who's going to be staying there a long time, understands the seasons, moves carefully and gradually, long cycles of adaptation that improve the institution in a generally agreed upon direction. And the subject is not the gardener. The subject is the garden, which the leadership literature sometimes tends to lose. Different views of responsibility, of planning, of goals, and although I don't have a separate section here on performance measurement, on metrics that presume to tell you how you're doing as regards your goals. I am a little, my son and I wrote a book on performance measurement, and I ended up being a little bit of a performance measurement skeptic. Although I nevertheless think I'm right. But I came across one summary that I like, and I think you would find interesting. You can find it here. No, that's not the one I wanted. Oh, I get it. Go to the next page. Criteria for performance. Oh, here we go. All versions of managed innovation call for greater precision in the measurement of results. I'm not sure what page we're on here in the regular model. 17? Thank you. Boy, he's good. In technology, this makes great sense because we want software, medicine, and machines that do what they're supposed to do. The problem is exporting this logic to the murky world of human behavior and collective action. Virtually all research on the subject indicates that the challenges of precise measurement of performance in the public sector are legion. On this point, I am partial to the wisdom of Sir Josiah Stamp, who wrote in 1887, "Public agencies are very keen on amassing statistics. They collect them, they add them, they raise them to the 9th power. They take the cube roots and prepare wonderful diagrams. But what you must never forget is that every one of these figures comes in the first instance from the village watchman who just puts down what he damn pleases." And having had administrative responsibilities and had to fill in boxes with numbers or ticks, and having been a kind of village watchman at some points, I believe that is more often the case than we think. Let's move on from comparing these two models. I want now to go to the third subject, which is rankings, although I ask you to think of rankings broadly in terms of awards, testing, report cards, a range of ordinal categories. They're forms of measurement, comparison, and evaluation. They are an interesting surrogate for the market in contexts where there isn't a logical market, or there isn't a typical market. If you decide to attend a particular university, it's not quite the same thing as buying a Whopper or buying a Big Mac. And let's say that you can compare the university you decide to attend as against other universities. You might look for rankings or some other reason why you have made that choice. And it might not be a market in the typical sense, particularly if you look at assessments or evaluations of universities. That all rankings, award systems, testing systems, membership systems are based on assumptions, and all assumptions are debatable. I'm not going to belabor that point, but I believe it to be correct. That such systems do not in fact measure quality. They measure impressions or perceptions or beliefs about quality. Keeping in mind that impressions and beliefs are important. Impression of quality may be more important than quality, in fact. Measures pick up reflections of status, bias, power, ignorance. Now, all measurement systems, for reasons I'm going to talk about in just a moment, punish outliers, organizations that don't fit. So if you're ranking orchestras and one orchestra uses 12-note scales and all the other orchestras use 10-note scales, you may be one of those very rare people who likes 12-note scales, but they're very rare. The dominant model tends to punish any model that deviates from I think of universities. How would it be if you had a university that didn't have departments, that didn't use student credit hours, and I could go on and elaborate all the characteristics, that didn't have transcripts? Think of how we have created a system that is so uniform, we all look roughly like one another. And what that does is, if anybody comes along and tries to create an alternative to that, it is extremely difficult. Now, we had some experimentation with that in the 60s. Crazy things happened in the 60s anyway. The country just went nuts. And one of the things it did was it created a half a dozen universities, new universities, some of which decided not to have departments, some of which decided not to have grades. And instead of transcripts, you got paragraphs from their professors. And it was a very interesting time. Well, that's 40 years ago, 50 years ago. All those universities are now, they now have departments. And incidentally, some of those universities also didn't have tenure. How does that sound to folks? At the Evergreen State College was one of them. What is now the University of Illinois at Springfield was another of them. They all now have fallen into line. Well, outliers are punished. Systems of rankings and report cards and testing tend to be unfriendly to innovation and to creativity and risk-taking. And now I wish to turn to the reasons why I believe that to be the case. The broad subject is isomorphism, but I use here a phrase taken from Weber. His argument, once he was finished describing bureaucracy, his ideal type, he went on to elaborate that that we shouldn't underestimate what he was describing, because these human creations are so remarkably effective that they become iron cages. They hold you in. And his argument was what they do for you is to provide order, which is a blessed thing, stability, predictability, reliability. It provides all of those things. And when you're in you're in a working environment that has those qualities, that's very, very valuable. Or if you live in a community that is governed in a way that is predictable, reliable. Now you hope it is predictable in a favorable way. I mean, the Nazis were predictable. They may have overdone it. But nevertheless, those were Weber's characterizations of the iron cage. Now, what has that got to do with what I wish to be talking about here? The link, it seems to me, is strategic planning. Not always, and it's sort of unfair to beat up strategic planning, but strategic planning is often the link. That to decide on your goals and to prioritize among them. So you rank your most important goal, and then you try to find the means to the end. The means and how are you going to get to that goal? How are you going to measure how well you have gotten to that goal? Following all of those processes, and that bureaucracies are powerful instruments that attempt to do that. What it does is it, in a context of order and predictability and reliability, it is a way to try to get things to change. So you've got these slow glacial forces, and you're trying to whip up some change, get things to be done in different ways. What happens is that bureaucracies tend strongly toward isomorphism when they start to deal with change. And let me attempt a couple of illustrations of that. And to use universities as an example. Universities are organized around schools and colleges and departments. It's extremely difficult to change that, but it's not unusual for a new leader to come in and to try to take that on, and I did that myself. And it's probably a good thing to do, but it's extremely difficult. So what's a way to get at it? Strategic planning. And it is a good way to get at it if it is done in a way that understands that you can't be in a big hurry, that it only works if it's bottom up, and you all know the points I'm trying to get at, and that that organizations in the same category, all armies, all schools, all universities, all hospitals, tend to look like each other. And the forms of isomorphism that cause these similarities are coercive. Sometimes we're forced to do this. I think of No Child Left Behind. I don't know many school districts that just couldn't wait for the national government to come up with an idea to tell them that they had to use testing as a way to improve themselves. But they did it nevertheless, every school district in America. And it is partly coercive. The federal government provided money and said, if you want to keep getting this money, here's what you will do. You will do testing and so on. It is mimetic. One reason that that universities are isomorphic is that we copy from each other. And if I want the University of Kansas to be a, quote, better university, which is to say a higher ranked university, how will I attempt to go about that? Well, what are the features and characteristics of this ranking, this ordinal listing of from best to worst? Well, what are your standards of admission? Are you sufficiently selective? Very selective universities get higher scores in these ranking systems than less selective. Now, is that a debatable assumption? Of course it is. Is selective are we fully agreed that selectivity is a good thing? Well, it all depends. After all, we have issues and concerns about diversity, about social class, about opportunities, fairness. So, but nevertheless, it is selectivity that wins in the way we presently do ranking. Do we have universities that get a lot of grants? Universities that get a lot of grants are higher ranked than universities that don't get a lot of grants. Getting grants is good. Therefore, to make this a greater university, what should we do? We should get more grants. And that influences our hiring and our promotions and so on. Now, following that reasoning, and you go through a whole list of things like that. The argument is that universities come increasingly to look like each other because they're essentially all following more or less the same template. We get some exceptions, and some universities are quite unique in some ways. I think of the Indiana University and its long time wonderful excellence in music and opera and symphonies and so on. It's just extraordinary. So we have examples of that. I think of the University of Kansas, and a wonderful thing we have here that gets way too little attention, a thing called scholarship halls. It's a remarkable thing that other universities would love to have, if they could. But they go back 40, 50, 60 years. It's a long time. They're still building them, incidentally. There have been a couple built in the last few years. But I think most faculty don't even know about them, to speak much of. So there are patterns of mimicry that cause us to be isomorphic. There are normative characteristics associated with being isomorphic. Most of those, incidentally, have to do with professions. I think of city managers as a profession, and they are carrying an isomorphic gene. I think isomorphism is more or less in their DNA. And now near the end of the lecture, there are 5 hypotheses that are testable for those of you who are interested in this subject. Let me turn now to a wrap-up. The one thing I I didn't mention was memberships. I should have mentioned that. The reason that's interesting to me is the University of Kansas is a member of the American Association of Universities, the single most prestigious organization of universities in the country. And the university is rightfully proud of that, and I think is a deserving member. I would include memberships in this category of rankings. And one of the measures is how many faculty in your university are fellows of the National Academy of Sciences, have had Guggenheim fellowships, have had Fulbrights, are MacArthur geniuses, on and on and on. That also, when we're attempting to hire foundation professors, which I think is a wonderfully good idea, but when we look for foundation professors, one of the things we look for is someone who's a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, and who fit these, and these are features of the rankers. When they rank the University of Kansas, they ask how many of your faculty are, but there are also bars in the iron cage. Where is it that someone is saying, instead of making the university look like a bunch of other universities, what is there unique about what we do? Is there anything unique about our environment, our context, the culture in which we find ourselves, that we could be creative about, be innovative about, and rather than benchmarking against somebody else, which is like cheating in a test. You try to come up with your own, you try to innovate, which is not easy, and it's also not quick. It takes time. Well, let me wrap up. Prizes, awards, rankings, and test scores are representations of status and legitimacy, bars in the iron cage of isomorphism. The iron cage of isomorphism explains the cycles of management fads and the instincts of executives in prestige organizations to be attracted to consultants who claim a leading-edge innovation, a new concept, or an answer to a vexing question. The paradox of the iron cage is this: in their pursuit of breakthroughs or creativity or innovation, organizations usually converge into an essentially indistinguishable lump. In this lump, they compete for the slightest differentiation, which is ranked first, second, third, which, when in fact the distinctions between them are very slight, distinctions without differences. Isomorphism is actually furthered by the combination of managed innovation and rankings, a perverse result, exactly the opposite of a search for authentic innovation. The potent mixture of ranking, performance measurement, and the logic of managed innovation cheats real lasting innovation. In the same way that the overemphasis on testing and the linking of testing to ranking and status has caused schools and colleges to cheat and to teach to the test, the assumptions of institutional ranking and prizes combined with the logic of managed innovation reduces the probability of innovation and especially lasting innovation. To weaken the iron cage, it is essential to break the weld which links the instinct for organizational ranking, for organizational innovation to ranking, prizes, status, and legitimacy. Once that weld is broken, the organization can worry less about legitimacy and prestige and more about genuine creativity. Only then can it break out of the iron cage. Virtually all of the empirical evidence is to the effect that public sector and nonprofit creativity is more likely, more enduring, and more effective following the logic of sustained innovation. It is the way to ameliorate the effects of the iron cage and to become genuinely creative, original, and innovative. Thank you.
I assume we have some time for questions. I don't know if that's my job too, but it is? Okay, it is my job. There, Lou, just shook your head. So, are there questions for George or comments? John?
I'd take you back to when you were president of Easter. And you were well known as an innovator. I was at Washington State University at that time, and there was a fight between the institutions over who would control Spokane higher education. And George was out front, but I wanted to ask you about the use of symbolism in innovation, in legitimizing innovation, because you came up with a new term. It was called co-location, rather than, what, branch campus or something else? How does that fit in with it? You didn't think anybody would remember that, did you? It was 30 years ago. But,
it's probably illegal.
You must be referring to somebody else, I don't remember. Yeah, we were, just an odd history. The two primary universities in the eastern part of the state of Washington are in small, very rural, distant places. Pullman, Washington, which is about 100 miles from Spokane.
yeah, it's not quite that much, but
Yeah,
it seems like
from the
more.
nearest airport, and the university that I was president of, which is about 15 miles. And so there'd been a long-standing question about what to do with Spokane. So one of my jobs was to try to work on that, which I did for 10 years. And we came up with, I do think that symbolism, rhetoric, is very important, and that effective leaders are often good at that. They can be a little too slick. I was often accused of that. But we certainly kept your leader on his toes.
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
You were seen as the pariah of the North.
No,